Hi, my name's Tim Jackson. I'm the director of the Centre for the Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity, CUSP, which is located in the University of Surrey in the United Kingdom. But we have partners actually all over the world and work with different academic institutions and indeed with government and with third sector institutions. And as the title suggests, our focus is on prosperity, and we have a very simple guiding question, if you like. What can prosperity possibly mean on a finite planet? And it's a powerful question in a way, because our prevailing notion of prosperity, the one that's dominated economic thinking for probably the last 100 years, is the idea that prosperity is achieved by increasing economic growth and at the personal level and the social level, having more and more access to more and more things, and in the cultural level, to essentially operating in a consumer society. And we know for sure that that model has run its course. It's environmentally damaging. It's created social inequality. It's been financially unstable, at least through the financial crisis from 10 years ago. And in our responses to that, it's left us vulnerable to the kinds of shocks that we are living through at the moment in the coronavirus pandemic. It's a model that perhaps was functional when we were not really able to kind of clothe ourselves properly, but it's a model that has to some extent run its course. And so asking what prosperity can mean on a finite planet is about almost reconceiving what progress means, what it means to be well as a human being, what it means to live well, what it is for communities to thrive and for people to flourish, and to flourish without incurring high costs on our environment, such as the cost of climate change and the devastating loss of biodiversity, and the pollution of groundwaters, and the plastic in the ocean, and the decimation of fish stocks, and the loss of our forests and the habitats of other creatures. Prosperity can't really ultimately work unless it has a respect for nature and has a respect for environmental limits. And likewise, it can't really work if it means prosperity for a few, while most people in the world still suffer from sometimes appalling poverties. So my prosperity, if you like, hangs on the prosperity of those around me. My prosperity means nothing very much if either it's gone tomorrow, so it's not a lasting prosperity, or it's not shared by my family, my friends, my community, my country, the other citizens in the world, and possibly also the other species in the world. Prosperity in the narrow sense of just being richer and consuming more just doesn't work anymore in terms of its environmental or social sustainability. So that's our challenge, and we address that challenge in all sorts of ways. It's obviously to some extent an economic challenge, because it means reconceiving the kind of economy that we want, and in that sphere we focus quite a lot on what's called post-growth economics. So the idea, in fact, that as time has gone on, the growth-based model of economics has become less and less useful, and it's also become less and less easy to attain. Growth itself has tended to be quite difficult to continue at the rates that we expected of it only a decade or so ago. And of course, in the current circumstances, it's gone away completely. So we have to be able to learn how to flourish, how to live well, how to prosper in a post-growth context. But we know very little about the macroeconomics of that. Our macroeconomics was built in the 1930s in response to the Great Depression, largely speaking, and it has served up to a point in the intervening years, but it's now no longer really able to talk to us about the organization of the economy in the context of a post-growth society. So developing the macroeconomics for that has been an important strand of our work. Another really important strand, though, is the question of what it means for human beings to live well within limits, and in particular within environmental limits, but also within social limits and within the limits of our own abilities, within the limits of our lifespan, if you like. We have an allotted time on Earth. Nobody knows exactly how long that is at the individual level. And within that time, we have the ability to do well, to thrive, to flourish. We have the ability to do lots of damage to the planet. And we have the ability also to create great friendships, to bring up children, to contribute to our communities. And our task in CUSP, in the Living Well theme, is really to explore those ways in which human beings really thrive, where they can actually achieve their optimal performance as human beings, where they can function fully, where they can be healthy, and where they can find fulfillment. And it's quite surprising. The psychology of that is absolutely fascinating, because it suggests, and some of our own work suggests this, that actually we find our greatest fulfillments in the things which are least material in their content, and that sometimes having very materialistic lives and lots of material accumulation stands in the way of finding our greatest fulfillment as human beings. So we're looking in CUSP for those places where people can actually reach their highest potential, their most fulfilling experiences, with the least possible impact on the environment, and looking at the conditions under which it's possible to experience those things. And that's a point, of course, where it's not just about individual actions. It's not just about, for example, I may spend half my day meditating, and that's a wonderful thing because I experience a degree of fulfillment that I never even imagined was possible. We can't all do that. We have to earn livelihoods. We have to work in the world, and we have to interact with other people. But nonetheless, we can bring some of that quality of fulfillment into both work and our interactions with other people. And we can develop the infrastructure, if you like, for a fulfilling world. And what's very interesting is that infrastructure for a fulfilling world is quite often also the infrastructure for a low carbon world. So a world, for example, in which it's possible for us to be physically active, and not necessarily rushing around in fossil fuel driven cars and aeroplanes all the time. A world in which we can interact with each other in social ways rather than in entirely material ways. And one of the biggest casualties of our lives during lockdown, of course, has been the loss of that social interaction. But I think that's a lesson to us too. It's a lesson to us to understand how important that social interaction is, and how important the spaces for that social interaction are, and how important it is to build our cities and our towns and our communities with an infrastructure that allows us to flourish in this social, relational way, more than in a purely materialistic way. So many of the calls as lockdown was being eased was for us to go out and fulfill our role as consumers, to go out and support our local businesses, which of course is a very laudable thing to do, but to buy stuff, to keep the economy going. And while that does help economic growth to some extent, and it does contribute to jobs in the economy, for example, it isn't in itself the be all and end all of what our economies should be doing. It is only valid insofar as it improves our ability to flourish in those more relational and social ways that I was talking about. And it stops being a benefit, actually, when our lives become crowded, busy, full of material stuff that signals nothing to anyone anymore, because material itself is so cheap to us, and consumer goods are so readily available, and they are so well regarded for such a short time before they're thrown away on the trash heap and contribute to the damage we're creating on the planet. So this fast, materially driven consumer world, which doesn't bring us the satisfactions that we might achieve as human beings, and sometimes actually stands in the way of those satisfactions. This is not a world to rush back into. It's a world, in fact, that we should look for alternatives to. So that brings me, I suppose, to the question of where those alternatives lie and whose responsibility it is to achieve them. And I hope in what I've said, you'll recognize that there's definitely a responsibility from government and from business and from local authorities in developing those infrastructures for what I would call livability, for a healthy, fulfilling lifestyle. But there's also a responsibility on individuals, and I suppose, you know, for me that's been a long-term task in my own life. I remember when I first started working back in London in I hesitate to tell you when it was because it was so long ago, the middle of the 1980s. And at that point, I was just finished being a student, so I was very reflective and philosophical about what I wanted in life. I was probably very romantically driven in terms of my utopian visions of what life should be. And I wasn't much enamored of the working world, because the working world in London in the mid-1980s was a fairly horrendous place to be. And even though I was at that point working broadly for environmental organizations, in civil society organizations, trying to do good in the world, I was still interacting with a world of work that was fierce and ferocious and busy and never stopped and never brought much in the way of satisfaction through work. And I was working at the time, it was the very, very early days of thinking about the policies related to climate change. And I remember on some days, because I worked in a small office in the north of London, I lived in the south of London, and the journey getting from one to the other was a very, very crowded train and an underground train. And I remember thinking, what's the purpose of this? What's the point of this? What's the point of me going to work today, if you like? And especially if the sun was shining, as it is today, actually, here in the UK, absolutely beautiful September day. It would have been maybe a similarly beautiful September day in the mid or late 1980s when I was working in London. And I kind of thought to myself, if my point is to go out and do some environmental work to combat climate change, might I actually be better sitting at home doing absolutely nothing? Or maybe going to a park in the neighborhood and reading a book for the whole day. I could read a book about climate change. I could read a book about the policies to address climate change. And maybe I would be doing as much there in that action as I would be by traveling across London in a noisy train and going to a busy office and getting, very, very busy all day long, solving problems related to climate change. Is it sometimes better to do nothing? I suppose was the question I was asking myself. And I go on asking it even as my life got busier and busier and the challenges got more and more intense. That idea actually of that all this business is the answer to the problems we're looking at is sometimes wrong, it seems to me. At a personal level, I think sometimes the answer is actually much more about slowing down, about stopping, about contemplating, about understanding, about taking the time to understand yourself, to taking the time to contribute to your family life, taking the time to think about where you are in the community, taking the time to relate, and taking the time to be aware of what it means to be human. And what's interesting about that is that is one of those routes that I was talking about before that we discovered in CUSP. It's one of those ways towards fulfillment, the endless rushing towards more and more and faster and greater progress actually is sometimes an impediment not just in terms of the environmental damage it causes, but actually an impediment to our own quality of life. And that's been a journey of mine, alongside things like not eating too much meat, not traveling if I don't have to, walking, cycling, being active, trying to be healthy, not buying too much stuff, not being carried away with material consumerism, not being obsessed with what stuff can bring. Alongside all that, this, if you like, this inner journey that allows us to explore who we are and what it means to prosper. And then if I was to think of people who inspire me, that's a really interesting question, because I've actually just finished writing a book, which it didn't start out this way, but it ended up being a kind of journey of people who inspired me, people, politicians, thinkers, activists, who have over the years addressed some of the challenges that we now face. And the book started actually with a kind of exploration of one particular person, Robert Kennedy, who sort of more than half a decade ago, not only saw that a model of an economy based around the GDP was missing certain basic elements, but he also saw that there were deeper concerns about social justice, concerns about the impact on the planet, and indeed concerns about our own sense of who we are. So beyond material poverty, he said, there's a poverty of dignity and meaning, and that's a sentiment that even 50 years, 5 decades, half a century later, actually is an incredibly important one. It's one that you rarely hear from political speeches at the moment, but it is, it remains for me an inspirational one. And from there, my journey in the book actually went through a variety of other characters. So Rosa Luxemburg, for example, for the extraordinary life story that she led in the early 20th century, and the worlds that she inhabited in trying to think about what a better society meant. And if you read some of the manifestos that she was responsible for talking about, they include much of what we would consider to be a part of the sustainability agenda today. And then thinkers who taught us how to look at who we are in the world, at the human condition. And I suppose I'm thinking there particularly of Hannah Arendt, the political philosopher, who really, I think, almost more than any thinker in the 20th century that I can identify, she looked at the way in which our interaction in the world, our basic aspirations and motivations in the world, work to try to come to terms with this one fundamental human condition, that we are finite material beings who only here for a short period of time, and yet we have these astonishing aspirations, and we also are plagued by a fear of our own mortality. We know we're only here for a short time. We know there's only so much in allocated hours to do the things that we would like to do, the things that contribute to society, the things that bring us pleasure, and the things that allow us to offset our own fear of our own mortality. And her writing around that topic is just extraordinarily thoughtful, and it inspires me towards the idea that actually, and this was one of her exhortations, if you like, is that we need to think more deeply, we need to think more carefully about what we're doing, about who we are, about what we want, and about how we get there. Thanks.